The winter that nearly erased her began with a sky the color of old tin, and a wind that moved like a rumor through Red Willow Creek. Snow gathered along the church steps in patient drifts, and beside the fence sat Eliza Mae Calder, folded into herself as if trying to take up less of the world. Her shawl had once been blue. Now it carried the dull gray of weather and waiting. No one spoke her name anymore. Doors opened for men with coin and for women with husbands. But for a widow with empty hands there was only the sound of boots passing and the careful avoidance of eyes. A year earlier she had stood at the edge of Jonah Calder's grave with frost stiffening her skirt, and the preacher promising that the Lord watched over sparrows, and surely over her. The promise had thawed and run off like snowmelt. Work came in scraps, a hem mended for a crust of bread, a button replaced for a night in a drafty barn. Shame taught her to move softly, to thank people who did not meet her gaze, to pretend she preferred the cold. That morning a ranch hand spat tobacco juice into the snow near her boot, and muttered that winter bred bad luck. Mrs. Dalloway Pike tightened her shawl and crossed the street as if grief were catching. Eliza lowered her eyes, not in agreement but in exhaustion, and pressed her palms together to keep them from trembling. Hunger moved inside her like a slow animal, patient and certain. A small boy paused long enough for her to stitch the torn seam of his glove. He watched her needle with solemn fascination, as though the act of repair were a kind of magic. When his mother noticed, she pulled him away with a hurried apology that carried no warmth, leaving Eliza with only the ghost of usefulness. She placed the mended glove on the fence post and told herself that dignity did not require witnesses, though it felt thinner without them. By noon the wind sharpened. She cupped a handful of snow to her lips, letting it dissolve against her tongue in place of a meal, and hummed the trail song Jonah used to sing when they drove cattle across spring grass. The melody rose and fell like a memory refusing to be buried. For a moment she saw him as he had been, hat tilted back, laughter easy, the promise of a life that would grow rather than contract. The vision faded, leaving only the ache of cold and the knowledge that even grief had grown quieter with time, as if it too were weary of her company. She might have remained there until dusk if not for the girls who approached without hesitation, their boots leaving twin rows of prints in the snow. They wore matching wool coats that had been let out and patched at the elbows, and their faces held the frank steadiness of children who had learned early that kindness required effort. One carried a parcel wrapped in cloth. "Do you got a home, ma'am?" the taller one asked, her voice clear but gentle. Eliza lied out of habit. "I do," she said, though her eyes betrayed the truth by flicking toward the empty road. The girls exchanged a glance that held more understanding than their years should allow. The smaller one held out the parcel, revealing half a biscuit still warm at its center. Eliza hesitated, pride tightening her throat, but hunger loosened her fingers. She accepted it with a nod that felt like a confession. They did not ask her name. Instead, they told her theirs, Clarabelle and Lily Grace Whitcomb. The names sounded like something from a hymn, soft and hopeful. They spoke of their father in the same quiet way, describing a man who worked hard and spoke little, whose hands were steady, but whose house had grown too silent since their mother died. Their words were careful, as if they were arranging a fragile object between them. The next day they returned, and the day after that, always with some small offering, a strip of dried apple, a pair of mittens stitched with uneven care. On the third visit they stood before her with a seriousness that made Eliza straighten despite herself. "You need a home," Clarabelle said, not as a question but as a simple truth. "And we need a bride for our pa," Lily Grace added, her eyes bright with a hope that made the air seem less bitter. The proposal was not romantic. It carried no blush, no coyness. It was an offering shaped by necessity and trust, a child's attempt to mend two broken places with one piece of thread. Eliza felt the words settle over her like a blanket she did not deserve. She imagined stepping into their house and bringing with her the whispers of the town, the stain of poverty, the fear of being turned out again. "I ain't fit for such things," she said, her voice rough. "Your pa deserves better." They did not argue. They simply left the mittens in her lap and walked away, their small shoulders squared against the wind. The mittens held the faint scent of wood smoke and soap. The smell of a home she had almost forgotten how to imagine. That night she found shelter in an abandoned stable at the edge of town. The boards creaked with each gust, and the darkness pressed close, thick with the memory of animals long gone. She turned the mittens over in her hands, tracing the crooked seams, and thought of the girl's steady gaze. Snow sifted through a gap in the roof and melted against her cheek like a hesitant touch. She tried to picture herself in the Whitcomb kitchen, her boots leaving wet marks on a clean floor, her presence an intrusion. She remembered selling her wedding ring for flour and watching the merchant weigh it without meeting her eyes. She remembered the sound of dirt striking Jonah's coffin, each thud a closing door. The past rose around her like a fence, convincing her that hope was a luxury meant for others. Yet the mittens were warm when she slipped them on, warmer than her own hands had been in months. The simple act of wearing them felt like accepting a kindness she had no coin to repay. She lay back against the rough boards and listened to the wind move through the gaps, a long, low moan that might have been grief or might have been the world reminding her she was still within it. Toward morning the storm deepened. Snow piled against the stable door, sealing her inside a pocket of silence. In that muffled space, she understood that survival alone was no longer enough. She was tired of enduring without belonging. The girls had not seen her as a burden or a warning. They had seen a woman who could sit at a table and mend a hem and perhaps, in time, laugh again. She rose before dawn, her breath a pale cloud in the dim light, and shook the snow from her skirt. The road beyond the stable stretched white and uncertain toward the Whitcomb ranch. Each step she imagined felt like trespass and invitation both. She paused at the threshold, fear tightening her chest, then pressed her gloved hands together and whispered into the cold, "Maybe Mercy still knows my name." When she stepped out into the storm, the wind struck her like a question she had chosen to answer. The Whitcomb ranch stood beyond the last fence of town, its outline softened by falling snow, and a single lantern burning beside the door, as if it had been waiting longer than the storm. Eliza paused at the gate, her boots heavy with ice, and wondered whether she had mistaken kindness for permission. Before she could retreat, the door opened and Silas Whitcomb stepped into the wind. He was taller than she expected, his coat unbuttoned despite the cold, his expression neither welcoming nor wary but steady, as though he had been told to expect her and had accepted the fact without question. "Supper's warm," he said, moving aside. No inquiries, no inspection, only a space cleared for her to enter. The warmth inside struck her like memory, wood smoke, stew, the faint sweetness of molasses. The twins looked up from the table with relief that needed no words. Eliza removed her shawl carefully, folding it as though it were still worthy of respect, and sat where Clara Belle nudged a chair out for her. Silas bowed his head before the meal, and when he spoke the blessing, he included her, without hesitation, the simple plural pronoun, settling around her shoulders like a cloak. Days found their rhythm without negotiation. Eliza rose early to sweep the floor and patch the curtains, her hands rediscovering the quiet authority of useful work. Silas split wood with deliberate strokes, stacking the logs near the door where she could reach them without crossing the yard. The twins braided her hair in the evenings, their small fingers patient, their chatter filling spaces that had once held only wind. No one spoke of permanence. The house grew around her the way a body accepts a healing bone, slowly and without spectacle. On the third morning she found a pair of sturdy boots beside her bed, the leather new but plain. Silas did not mention them. She wore them anyway, the unfamiliar firmness beneath her feet, changing her gait from apology to intention. When she thanked him, he nodded once and asked whether the hens had been fed, granting her gratitude the dignity of being folded into ordinary concern. The first time she rode into town with the twins to buy flour, the air shifted. Conversations dimmed as she entered the mercantile, eyes tracking her with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. Mrs. Dalloway Pike's voice rose deliberately above the murmur, remarking that some men mistook charity for matrimony. Eliza felt the old shame rise, a reflex sharpened by months of hunger and exclusion. She placed her coins on the counter with a hand that trembled despite her resolve. Silas did not answer the gossip, He lifted the sack of flour and guided the twins toward the door, his silence neither defensive nor embarrassed but final. Outside, the cold bit at Eliza's cheeks, and she realized he had chosen not to perform their worth for an audience that had already judged them. The restraint unsettled her more than anger would have, for it demanded that she believe in their place, without external validation. That evening she considered leaving. She imagined the twins waking to find her gone, their small hopes folded away like outgrown dresses. She feared that her presence might draw the town's contempt onto their doorstep, that kindness extended to her might cost them acceptance. While she stood at the window, Silas entered with an armful of kindling and set it beside the stove. He did not ask what troubled her. Instead, he placed a cup of coffee near her hand and said, "Storm's coming." The statement carried an invitation to remain through it, an assumption that her leaving was neither expected nor desired. The blizzard arrived before dawn, a white roar that swallowed the barn and bent the fence posts until they groaned. Snow forced its way through the smallest cracks, and the roof shuddered under its weight. Silas fought the wind to secure the livestock, returning with a hand split open by a slipped rope. Blood marked the snow like a warning. Eliza wrapped the wound with strips torn from her petticoat, her movements swift and unhesitating, the old instincts of care returning as naturally as breath. With Silas unable to lift or hammer, the tasks shifted without discussion. Eliza hauled water from the pump, her new boots sinking deep but holding firm. She carried feed to the barn, her breath forming clouds that vanished in the gale. The twins followed with lanterns, their faith in her absolute and unguarded. Inside the house, she melted snow for drinking water and read aloud from a tattered almanac to steady their nerves, her voice threading calm through the storm's fury. Silas watched her from the chair near the stove, his injured hand resting useless in his lap, and in his gaze she saw recognition rather than gratitude. He did not see a burden repaid, but a partner revealed. The understanding settled between them like a third presence, quiet and undeniable. When the storm broke, the world emerged altered but intact. Drifts lay high against the barn, and the sky cleared to a hard blue that promised colder nights. Together, they cleared the path to the well, working in companionable silence. At midday the twins collapsed in the snow, laughing, their cheeks bright with the simple joy of survival. Eliza felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she had carried since Jonah's burial finally giving way. That evening Silas brought a rocking chair from the back room, its wood polished by years of use. He repaired a loose rung with his good hand and placed it beside Eliza's sewing chair. The gesture was modest, almost practical, yet it carried the weight of inclusion. The chair had belonged to his late wife. Setting it there acknowledged the past without asking Eliza to replace it. She sat in it hesitantly, the motion gentle, and felt the house adjust around her as if accepting the new balance. The twins fell asleep with their heads against her shoulders, their breaths warm through her sleeve. Firelight painted the walls in gold, and outside the last of the wind moved through the eaves like a memory receding. Silas stood by the window for a long moment before speaking. "You brought spring with you," he said, the words simple and unadorned. No declaration followed, no demand for answer. The statement existed as fact, allowing her to accept or reject it in her own time. Eliza looked at the sleeping girls, at the mended chair, at the boots by the door, and understood that belonging had grown not from charity, but from shared labor and quiet regard. She did not speak. She only reached to adjust the blanket over the twins, her hand steady. On Sunday they rode into town together. The church bell rang with its usual authority, summoning a congregation accustomed to familiar hierarchies. Eliza felt the weight of eyes as she entered beside Silas, the twins between them. Whispers rose like insects disturbed by light. She kept her gaze forward, recalling the path she had cleared through snow, the water she had carried, the nights she had held fear at bay with her voice. When the twins ran ahead and called her Ma, without hesitation, the word moved through the room with the force of truth rather than announcement. Silas took her hand, not as a display, but as continuation of a habit formed at the ranch. The preacher faltered in his reading, the cadence of judgment interrupted by a reality he had not sanctioned. Eliza felt no triumph, only a deep steadiness, as though she had stepped fully into her own name. Afterward they walked back into the pale afternoon, the town's gaze following but no longer defining. At the ranch she planted winter roses beside the fence, pressing the roots into soil still cold but yielding. Silas held the lantern while she worked, its light pooling around their hands. The twins knelt nearby, packing earth with careful palms. When the last stem stood upright, Eliza removed her old shawl and draped it over the fence. The fabric stirred once in the breeze, then settled, a relic of endurance no longer required for warmth. She straightened, the scent of turned soil rising clean and new, and saw the house with its lit window not as shelter granted, but as home earned. Inside, the table was set for four, the chairs worn in familiar patterns. Silas hung his hat by the door and placed his injured hand, now healing, over hers in brief acknowledgment of the path they had walked. The twins argued softly about whose turn it was to say grace, their voices weaving in ordinary music that carried no hint of absence. Later, when the fire burned low and the lantern glowed steady against the dark, Eliza stepped outside once more. The snow had begun to melt at the edges, revealing dark lines of earth beneath. She looked toward the road that led back to town, its distance unchanged, yet its power diminished, and felt a quiet certainty that she would not travel it alone again. Some winters, she understood, are not endured but transformed, their cold shaping the space where warmth can finally take root. If you have ever stood at the edge of a door believing yourself unworthy to enter, remember that mercy often arrives in small hands and plain words, asking only that you accept the place prepared for you. And if this fire has warmed something long frozen within you, stay a little while longer and ride with us into the next tale.